Friedrich Karl. Fritz von Lossberg was a German colonel, and later general, of World War I. He was a strategic planner, especially of defense, who was chief of staff from the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Armies. He was present at the battles of the Somme, Arras, and Verdun. Loszberg was born in Bad Homburg in Hesse-Nassau.Erich Ludendorff refers to him as Loszberg in his memoirs. Elsewhere, it is sometimes also spelled Loszberg. Loszberg was later to become legendary as the fireman of the Western Front, always sent by L to the area of crisis. He was the foremost German expert on defensive warfare, was made a floating chief of staff in problem areas with Wehrmacht, the right to issue orders in a superior's name. The British official history refers to him as a very remarkable soldier. Loszberg was awarded the Blue Max for his work on the Western Front on 24 April 1917. Throughout the 18 months which Colonel von Lossberg spent in Mézières, he was straining at Belice to return to more active work at the front, and the first opportunity, which came by accident, he seized with both hands. His chief, Colonel Tappan, was still away when the French offensive was delivered on 25 September, and von Lossberg deputized for him when General Falkenhayn explained the situation to the Kaiser, William II, the following morning. A message had come through earlier from the Chief of Staff of the Third Army, Lieutenant General von Hern, that the left corps might have to be withdrawn 2 miles to behind the Dormoise, and Colonel von Lossberg, during his account of the situation on the Champagne battlefront, expressed strong disapproval of such an action. Within 3 hours of that interview he was on his way to replace General von Hern as Chief of Staff, a marked honor for a junior colonel of only 2 months' seniority, as all the other chiefs of staff of armies were at least major generals. Von Lossberg was one of the leading proponents of the system of defense in depth. Aged 71, Major General Fritz von Lossberg retired from the army in 1927. Elsewhere his dates are given as 1868 to 1942, early life and the first years of World War I. Loszberg was commissioned in the Guards Regiment in 1888, the third generation of his immediate family to serve in it. He qualified as a general staff officer and in 1911 became an instructor at the Kriegsakademie. He was appointed Chief of Staff of the 13th Württemberg Army Corps in 1913. In 1914 it fought on both the Western and Eastern fronts. Promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in January 1915, he was transferred to Mézières, France, as Deputy Chief of Operations. He already knew the Supreme Commander, Erich von Falkenhayn, as well as the Chief of Operations and other members of the staff, while the Kaiser remembered him as the fencing lieutenant in Berlin. The Germans defended the Western Front in the Prussian tradition. The defenders were massed in the front line and instructed to hold what you are ordered to hold. Some of the old staff foresaw that with more guns and ammunition the enemy's pre-attack barrages would soon be converting the crowded front line into a slaughterhouse. The thinking was stimulated by instructions captured from the French Fifth Army in May 1915 stipulating 3 lines of defense. The first line was manned by sentry groups, with listening posts in front. It was to be strongly built but lightly garrisoned. If attackers broke through they would face a second main line of resistance, which included dugouts to accommodate all of the defenders of the first 2 lines. A third line incorporated shell-proof shelters for the reserves. The artillery was just behind it. On the old staff, Colonels Max Bauer and Buster and Captains Gaar and Haber liked the idea of defense in depth and discussed making it flexible, by permitting the garrison of the front line to retreat to join the main line of resistance if the front was breached. Loszberg was attracted by defense in depth, but argued firmly against elasticity, because he had been impressed in battle by the demoralizing effect of fleeing men. Third Army. In September 1915 the French attacked in Champagne, east of Reims along a front of 30 kilometers, advancing behind a cloud of poison gas and smoke. The German Third Army was driven out of the front line. The Chief of Staff proposed to withdraw 3 kilometers further to shelter behind a river. He was replaced by Loszberg, who just as he arrived at Army headquarters was telephoned by a corps commander asking whether they would still withdraw that night. Loszberg ordered him to hold where they were. A few minutes later he met his commander, General Karl von Arnim, who endorsed the cancellation and agreed that Loszberg might go immediately to the front with full powers. The French were sure to attack again once they had moved their artillery forward. When Loszberg arrived at the height on the north side of the valley they had been driven into, he was immediately struck by the strength of the position they had been forced to occupy. They were now defending a reserve trench on a reverse slope 200 meters beneath the crest. This line was hidden from French artillery observers on the ground, but still gave the defenders plenty of space to mow down attackers who emerged over the crest. Its flaw was that the German artillery observers, usually placed in the front line, were also blind. Loszberg ordered the observers to set up the positions along the crest where he was standing, which gave them a perfect view of the slope opposite where attackers would appear, and they would no longer work in the noisy, smoky confusion of the front line during an attack. The reserves were placed just behind the northern hill. Loszberg ordered shelters to be built for them. Pickets were dotted along the crest of the hill facing the French. These depositions fit perfectly to his belief that the strength of the defense lies in concealment from enemy observation. Then he motored to the headquarters of each of his corps to direct them to position the lines similarly. The new defense stymied further French attacks. Second Army. When the British and French attacked at the opening of the Battle of the Somme, Falkenhayn summoned Loszberg to his bedside at 01:00 to ask him to take over as Chief of Staff of the German Second Army, the southernmost on the attacked front, where the French had penetrated. Loszberg would agree only if the ongoing German attacks at Verdun were stopped. Falkenhayn shook hands, but never kept his promise. At Second Army headquarters its commander, Fritz von Lossberg, gave Loszberg permission to go to front with full power to issue commands. When Loszberg saw how the original front-line trenches had been utterly demolished by the enemy barrage, he ordered the defenders to stand where they were, but to adopt a mobile defense in depth. The front line was to be held lightly, with the defenders moving forward into shell holes as soon as a bombardment began. The artillery observers were moved behind the main line of resistance to heights where the reserves for the battalion holding the sector were also sheltered. Enemy penetrations would be driven back by counterattacks. If possible, an immediate counterattack would be launched by the 2 reserve battalions of the regiment holding the sector. It would be led by the frontline battalion commander, who knew the conditions best. Close behind the front, Loszberg stationed counterattack divisions. In Loszberg's system, corps, which had contained a set trio of divisions, became responsible for the length of front held by 3 divisions. The divisions making up the corps were changed if necessary, but corps remained responsible for its terrain. If an attack threatened, Loszberg tried to be in the front line at daybreak to gauge morale. Most days Bello and Loszberg visited a section of the front, except during attacks when they had to be at the telephone exchange. They were careful to relieve divisions when they had given their all. After Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over Ole on 29 August 1916, Loszberg was delighted to watch the spirit of the army revive. The German attacks on Verdun were stopped immediately. Unlike the predecessors Moltke and Falkenhayn, the new team solicited and freely discussed ideas. Loszberg was asked for a report describing his defensive tactics. In September, construction began on a new backup line well behind the current front, which the enemy called the Hindenburg Line. It was built with all recent refinements, including shallow dugouts with concrete roofs that could be left quickly when attacks began. But when Loszberg motored through the almost completed line, he saw that the artillery observation posts were built into the front line trenches, which therefore were on a forward slope exposed to enemy ground observers. Supported by below and their army group commander the Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, Loszberg successfully argued for building a new front line, wherever possible on a reverse slope, with positions for a light line of first resistance on the crest. So now the artillery observers were in the second line, overlooking the enemy. Ole issued a paper, The Conduct of the Defensive Battle, on 1 December 1916. Mostly written by junior staff officers, it incorporated many of Loszberg's ideas for mobile defense in depth, but also recommended elasticity, permitting the defenders of the front line to retreat if forced. Loszberg still strongly opposed elasticity in his report that Ole published on 30 January 1917. Sixth Army. The British attacked the German Sixth Army near Arras on 9 April 1917, advancing behind a creeping barrage for almost 4 kilometers, capturing the heights of Vimy Ridge, which gave their observers a commanding view over the entire plain. On the 11th of April 1917, Loszberg was made Chief of Staff of Sixth Army. He found the defenders in chaos, but in the Crown Prince Ruprecht's words, he was almost superhumanly imperturbable. He swiftly organized new defensive lines, telephoning Ludendorff that this time the defense would be elastic because the front line was so readily observed. If forced, the front line defenders would withdraw and the battle would be fought at the second line, which was mostly on a reverse slope, which the German artillery observers in the rear line could see clearly. Counter-attacking infantry were now using newly developed stormtrooper tactics. When reserve divisions advanced from the artillery protection line to counter-attack, they came under the command of the division they were supporting. Repeated British attacks gained no significant ground. Fourth Army. After the brilliant British capture of the Messines Ridge on 8 June 1917, Ludendorff asked Loszberg to move to Flanders as Chief of Staff of the Fourth Army, commanded by General Friedrich von Lossberg. Loszberg knew the typography of the Ypres salient from 1914. For the first time he could organize a mobile defense in depth before an attack began. He strove to make the defenders invisible to attackers on the ground and even to their aerial observers. As soon as the bombardment began, the men in the foremost line left the trenches to shelter in shell holes scattered randomly about in front of the line that the British artillery was smashing. These defenders were provided with boards so they could shelter above the groundwater that filled the bottoms of the holes, and with corrugated iron and canvas for crude roofs. They were to fight to the end from these holes with the light machine guns. The second line of resistance was about 4.5 kilometers behind the front, near the effective limit of the enemy's field guns. It had concrete nests for heavy machine guns and shelters for riflemen, mortar crews, and light machine gunners. But if the attackers broke through, most of the defenders moved into shell holes so they could strike from unexpected directions. They also were to hold their positions even if the line was penetrated. Before successful attackers reached the artillery protection line, they would be met by counter-attackers from the reserve division. The 14-day, 6 million shell bombardment ended on the 31st of July 1917. The British anticipated that their infantry would advance 5 to 8 kilometers on the first day. By midday, the surviving attackers were penetrating the second line of resistance when they were smashed into by counter-attackers, who pushed them back even as the rain began to pour down. The start of dismal, sodden, bloody weeks. The day after the attack, Loszberg was promoted to Major General. On the 16th of August 1917, the British attacked again, but with orders to advance only 1,500–2,000 yards before digging in to repel counterattacks. Such bite-and-hold tactics forced the Germans to change also. Ludendorff, who increasingly directed the defense, placed more men in the foremost line and waited until the following day to mount a carefully organized counterattack. But the British artillery overwhelmed the foremost defenders and their immediate supports. On the 7th of October, the German returned to a lightly held front which would retire to the main resistance line, where they would be joined by counterattack troops, while a dense artillery barrage would be laid in front of the main resistance line. The emphasis was still on a mobile defense. Companies were assigned zones, rather than lines, to defend. After Ludendorff took responsibility, Loszberg does not describe the further changes in his book, which obviously was based on a diary. The final configuration was that each front division should establish a main line of resistance 400 meters behind the front. It consisted of strong points which would hold out even if the line was breached. Heavy machine guns, working in pairs, were just behind this position, along with a few field guns as anti-tank weapons. The battle zone extended to a depth of 8 kilometers behind the front. It was dotted with points of resistance that if necessarily would be held until relieved by the counterattack. Since the maximum range of field artillery was 8 kilometers, attackers nearing the end of the battle zone could only be supported by the heavier guns. A reserve division was in position close behind this battle zone. If it launched a counterattack, it was led by the commander of the division at the front. This defensive doctrine was carried over after the end of World War I. After enormous sacrifice, by bite and hold, the British took the Passchendaele Ridge on the 30th of November 1917. Now they faced another strong line of German fieldworks, while still another behind that was close to completion. 1918 and beyond. Loszberg wrote little in his memoirs about 1918, the year in which the Germans launched their astonishing breakthrough offensives on the Western Front, starting with Operation Michael, which smashed through the British lines near Cambrai. It created a vast salient that increased the length of the German defensive front, but failed to take any major strategic objective. Loszberg urged Earl to withdraw from the useless but costly salient, but they did not. The next major attack was by Fourth Army in Flanders, in which Loszberg was chief of staff. It attacked in the Battle of the Lys. There was another brilliant breakthrough, which after the initial successes was stalled by reserves manning a stout mobile defense in depth. On Loszberg's advice, they stopped attacking even though they had not reached the major railway junction that was their objective. Earl then shifted the attack to Champagne, to draw away the French troops who had been sent to help the British in Flanders. The German advance in the Third Battle of the Aisne was the most remarkable yet. They reached the right bank of the River Marne, only 56 kilometers from Paris, which the French government prepared to evacuate. Old decided that they must enlarge this salient, so they would be able to bring forward enough supplies to drive on to Paris. On part of the sector assaulted, the French front line was lightly held and easily overrun, but as they thrust forward, the attackers unexpectedly encountered the main line of resistance, beyond the range of the German field guns, where they were stopped. Old decided to strike again in Flanders, to finish off the British. Ludendorff came on the 18th of July 1918 to discuss the next operation with the commanders there, including the Crown Prince Ruprecht and Loszberg, who found Ludendorff aggressive and confident. His mood was shattered by a telephone call reporting that the French and Americans had smashed through the right flank of the salient pointing toward Paris. On the opening day of the Battle of Soissons, everyone in the room realized that they had lost the war. There were no more German attacks. Instead, Hull was forced slowly to withdraw the Western Front, hoping to establish a shorter defensive line that could be held. First, they had to evacuate all of the wounded, then essential supplies like food and ammunition, and finally the fighting troops, who were being assaulted all along the front. They reorganized for withdrawing. On the 8th of August 1918, Loszberg became Chief of Staff of Army Group von Bohn, made up of 2nd, 18th, and 9th Armies. Early in November he was reassigned to Hull. The armistice specified that all German troops still remaining in France, Belgique, Luxembourg, or Alsace-Lorraine after 14 days would become prisoners of war. They were all out in time, a final display of the organizational skill of the German staffs. In the small post-war German army, the Reichswehr, Loszberg was first in charge of defending the new eastern border with Poland. Then he became General Chief of Staff and later commanded the 6th Division. He retired in 1927 as a General of Infantry and died in Lübeck on the 14th of May 1942. His son Bernhard was also a General Staff officer, known for his plans for the invasion of Russia. Decorations and awards. Loszberg was an honorary citizen of Bad Homburg, his hometown, and received medals and decorations: Iron Cross of 1914, 1st and 2nd class, Palm Merit with oak leaves, Order of the Red Eagle, 4th class, Order of the Crown, 3rd class, Knight's Cross of the Royal House, Order of Hohenzollern with swords, Service Award, Honor Cross, 2nd class of the Princely House, Order of Hohenzollern with swords, Knight's Cross of the Military Order of Max Joseph, Military Merit Order, 3rd class with swords and crown, Commander's Cross, 2nd class of the Military Order of St. Henry, Knight's Cross, 2nd class of the Albert Order with swords, Commander of the Military Merit Order, Knight's Cross of the Order of the Crown, Commander 2nd class of the Order of the Zähringer Lion, Bravery Medal, Military Merit Cross, 2nd class, Knight's Cross, 1st class of the Order of Henry the Lion, Knight's Cross, 1st class of the House and Merit Order of Peter Frederick Lewis, Commander of the Order of the White Falcon, Hanseatic Cross of Bremen, Commander, 1st class of the Ducal Saxe-Ernestine House Order with swords, Cross for Merit in War.